Hey everybody, good evening. My name is Christy. I'm part of the Student Doctor Network team here. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We have with us this evening Dr. Jim Dahle, who's the author of the blog The White Coat Investor, as well as a book by the same title. Dr. Dahle is a practicing full-time board-certified emergency physician. He began educating himself on the ins and outs of personal finance and investing while he was in residency, when he got tired of being ripped off by financial professionals. He started the blog in 2011, and today it's the most widely read physician-specific personal finance and investing blog in the world, with over 200,000 page views per month. So we're excited to hear from him. We'll start tonight with a presentation on the top 5 financial considerations for starting residents. Then we'll have about 30 minutes of Q&A time at the end. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, you can submit those in the question box on the control panel on your right, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar here. So Dr. Dahle, thank you so much for being with us tonight. From here, I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here. And thank you to all of you who are taking time out of your busy schedules to learn a few important financial concepts that should serve you well in the future. The Student Doctor Network approached me a few months ago and asked me to do a webinar on this subject and hopefully help those who can really use this information, get it earlier in their careers when it's most useful. So I've titled this, The Top 5 Financial Considerations for Starting Residents. Before we get into it, though, I need to make a couple of disclosures and show my conflicts of interest. As mentioned, I have a for-profit website. It's called The White Coat Investor. I sell all kinds of ads on it. The information there is free to you, however, and I intend to keep it that way. But if you visit my website, it's possible I may make some money as a result of that. I also get royalties from my book. Anybody that buys it on Amazon or from any other bookseller, I end up getting some money for each copy that's sold. SDN is also paying me a fee tonight to run this webinar. However, my income, the vast majority of it, still comes from clinical medicine, just like yours does or will soon. So our format tonight, we're going to have this 30-minute presentation, followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers. The presentation may be a little bit shorter or a little bit longer than that. Either way, I'm sure there will be plenty of good questions to go over. Feel free to submit those as mentioned in the panel on the right of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. Any questions we don't get to tonight will be posted into the Student Doctor Network Finance and Investing Forum, and I'll try to address them there, as I hope other readers will as well. All right, an important caveat. Anytime there's a presentation to doctors or medical students about money, I think it's important to mention this. Money doesn't bring happiness. That's not entirely true. If you look at the studies, it shows that up to about $75,000 a year, it really does make you more happy to make more money. But beyond that point, it really doesn't bring any more happiness. You didn't go into medicine primarily for the money, and neither did I. But if you ignore it, it can sure make your life miserable. Now, let's go ahead and talk about money for the rest of this presentation. So our top financial considerations tonight are going to be, number 1, becoming financially educated. 2, have a plan for your student loans. 3, buy disability and life insurance. 4, live on much less than you make. And 5, start saving for retirement. This presentation is geared primarily to the brand new resident or someone about to start residency, but it's obviously applicable to just about anybody, especially medical students, pre-med students, residents, and even early attendings. So the first step is to become financially educated. As you recall, in medical school, you really don't learn a lot about what you're going to be doing the whole rest of your life. You really learn the language of medicine, all the different terms, all the anatomy, how all the parts of a hospital work together, etc. And in your residency, you really learn how to practice medicine and what you'll be doing for the rest of your life. Just like medicine has its own specific language, so does finance. And until you are as familiar with the terms used in finance as you are in medicine, you're right to be taken advantage of by financial professionals. A lot of doctors are surprised to find out that finance has a literature. There's a journal of financial investing, a journal of financial planning. There's a journal of investing. There's a journal of retirement planning. And they have peer-reviewed literature just like every field of medicine does. There's a little bit of science to it, and it's worth learning what the evidence shows about personal finance investing. But the most important thing to remember is that personal finance and investing for retirement really isn't a science or an art. It's more of an engineering problem, and you just want to basically get close enough. Becoming financially educated means becoming familiar with a lot of the terms I'm going to go over here very quickly. I'm not even going to try to explain all of these things, but you at some point in the next year or two ought to learn and know what each of these things means and refers to. For example, the rule of 72 that tells you how fast your money will grow due to compound interest. The 4% rule, which is considered the safe withdrawal rate for retirees. The difference between stocks and bonds. The moving parts of a mortgage, including fees, points, and the interest rate. The student loan programs such as ITR, IBR, PAY, and PSLF. The difference between tax-deferred and tax-free accounts. How to use a backdoor Roth IRA and why most attendings ought to be doing so. A high-deductible health plan and a health savings account and how you can use that as another retirement account. The difference between 401ks, 403bs, 457s, for the self-employed, SEP IRAs versus solo 401ks. Also for the self-employed, deciding what kind of business structure to have, sole proprietorship versus an LLC versus an S corporation or a C corporation. If all these terms are complete mysteries to you, you've got some financial education you need to be doing. There are a number of different ways to title your home. The best one, tenants by the entirety, is available in most states. It gives you pretty significant asset protection, but you need to understand that when you buy the house. You also ought to understand what kind of assets are protected in your state. In some states, all of your home equity is protected. In others, almost none of it is. You also need to understand things like the federal estate tax exemptions and real estate terms if you're going to be investing in real estate, terms like the cap rate, the net operating income, and the 55% rule. You need to understand the differences between term and permanent insurance, between annuities and mutual funds. You need to know what a reasonable price for financial advice is. A lot of doctors don't know what the going rate is for financial advice. And because of that, they're likely going to be taken advantage of. You need to understand the difference between fee-only, and fee-based, and commissioned advisors. You need to understand when you use a will and when you use a revocable trust, and why most docs probably eventually ought to have both. Also, irrevocable trusts have some uses for estate planning. Family limited partnerships are another term most docs aren't familiar with. And there's a whole slew of different types of permanent life insurance, including whole life, variable life, universal life, indexed universal life insurance. You can learn about investing, about asset classes and their expected returns, about the advantages of index funds, about the cost matters hypothesis proposed by John Bogle, as well as the efficient market hypothesis. You need to learn about modern portfolio theory and expense ratios and the difference between arithmetic returns and geometric returns. What I wanted to do with these last 4 slides is overload you just a little bit and show you that there are some things that you're probably not familiar with at this point, and you need to become so, or else your finances are really not going to do that well. You can hire somebody to do a lot of this work for you, but the truth is, it's hard to know if you're getting a really good advisor until you know almost enough to do it yourself anyway. So one of the tasks I think that everybody should do, especially as they start earning their first paycheck as residents, is to begin this process of financial education. So how do you do it? Well, residency is primarily to learn medicine. You shouldn't be spending all your time learning about finances for sure. But luckily, finance is a lot easier to learn. There's a lot less information and a lot less practice. I suggest you read a good blog. I think mine's pretty good. I also suggest you read a good finance book each year, not only in residency, but throughout your career. Talk to your attendings, especially your community attendings when you rotate in the community, about their business. And also, it's wise to spend some time on some forums, like the Bogleheads Forum for Investing, the Fairmark Forum for Taxes, and the SDN Finance and Investing Forum, which is co-hosted with my website, where you can discuss a lot of the physician-specific issues. Okay, the second consideration that most starting residents ought to have is to take a look at their student loan plan. If you have student loans, you need a plan to take care of them. There's really 4 goals that your plan should have. The first is to minimize your loans, okay? Not only in and especially this takes place obviously in medical school. You want to take as few loans as possible out by living as inexpensively as you can. Just let me go back there. You also want to make sure your payments are affordable in residency, and you want to qualify for any possible forgiveness. Lastly, but not necessarily least important, you want to minimize the amount of interest you pay. So let's take each of these 4 goals one by one. The first is to minimize your loans. For the pre-meds who are reading this, I encourage you to go to the least expensive school that you can get into in a low cost of living area. It's an immense handicap to come out of medical school with $450,000 or $500,000 in high interest rate student loans. And the best way to do that, to avoid that, is to go to a less expensive school. But even if you're already in school, there are ways to minimize your costs. If you're single, get some roommates. If you're married, have your spouse work. You may even find there are a few times in medical school when you can work and earn some money. Every little bit you earn and the less you spend, the less student loan burden you will have. And it really does make a difference. It doesn't just disappear as soon as you become an attending. Many attendings end up dragging these loans out for 20 or 30 years. Perhaps when you go to spend money as a medical student, the best thing to do is to remember that everything you're buying really costs 2 to 3 times more than you're paying for it. Because by the time all that interest adds up over the next few years, that's what you'll have spent on that item. So the second goal of your student loan plan should be to lower your payments in residency. The initial program was called ICR, income contingent repayment. That later became income-based repayment, and more recently it has become the pay-as-you-earn program, which anybody coming out of medical school now ought to be enrolled in. The pay payments are basically limited to 10% of your discretionary income. Now, discretionary income is your gross income, your adjusted gross income, which is line 38 on your 1040, minus 150% of the poverty line. So your poverty line depends on how many kids you have and whether you're married or not. But if you're a 4-person family, it's $23,850. So if your resident income is $50,000 and you have a family of 4, then you can look at the 150% poverty line there at $35,775. So your discretionary income divided by 12 is $1,185 per month. So 10% of that is $119 per month. So that's what your payments would be if you were making $50,000 and you had a family of 4. Notice how there's no relationship whatsoever to your interest rate or to the loan size. And because of that, for most medical students, despite the fact that you're making these payments all the way through medical school, your debt will continue to grow. But at least you'll be able to make the payments. The third goal is, if possible, to obtain some forgiveness for those student loans. The IBR program has a forgiveness aspect to it. If you make 25 years worth of qualifying payments working for any employer, you get the rest of your debt forgiven. Of course, 25 years is a long time, and that forgiveness is completely taxable. The pay program made a slight improvement on this in that you only have to make payments for 20 years. Of course, it's still taxable, so you better save some money up to pay the taxes on that. The Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, however, is a little bit different. In that, you only have to make 10 years of payments, and that includes any payments made during residency or fellowship. However, you have to work for a 501c3 employer, essentially a nonprofit. You can't just contract with one, nor can you just come work in their hospital and have your private practice on the side. But if you can make 10 years worth of payments, your forgiveness is tax-free. So the moral of the story is, start making your payments as soon as possible, because you want to make as many tiny little payments as you can. These little $100 payments that you can make during residency are the ones that really are going to determine how much is left to forgive at the end of 10 years, or 20 years if you're in the pay or IBR program. Okay, so the decision of whether to go for forgiveness really comes in right after you finish residency or fellowship and go and become an attendee. If your job is public service loan forgiveness eligible, meaning you're employed by a 501c3 and you've already made 3 to 6 years worth of payments, you should go for forgiveness, because with just 4 more years of payments, the rest of your debt will be forgiven. If you have a very low salary to loan ratio, meaning you have $400,000 or $500,000 worth of loans, and you're a pediatrician, you should probably go for the pay forgiveness, making those payments for a full 20 years. Just remember to save up some money on the side to pay the taxes on that forgiveness. If you have a moderate to high salary to loan ratio, for example, if you have a more average loan burden of $200,000 or even less, or you make a moderate to high salary, you ought to refinance the loans. There are several institutions you can do this with. The three most commonly used ones are called SoFi, Darien or White and Bank, and Common Bond. And basically, you can take your loans with the federal government are 5.5% to 8%, and you can refinance them to a fixed rate of 4 to 5%, or a variable rate as low as 3%. If you're only going to have those loans for a couple of years and get them paid off fast, you may want to run that interest rate risk and get the variable loan. If you think you're going to be stretching them out for a while, though, it's probably best to get a fixed rate. Okay, the third financial consideration for a new resident is an insurance plan. If there's anyone depending on your income besides you, meaning a spouse or children or some other kind of dependent, you need to buy a big term life policy. Okay, these are not expensive. A healthy 26-year-old female can buy a 30-year term policy that's only $510 per year for $1 million. So if you die that year, your heirs get $1 million, and all it cost you was $500. If you need more than that, more than you can afford as a resident, you can buy a smaller policy, or you can also buy a larger 5-year level term. By only getting a 5-year policy, it's only $240 per million, so about half the price. But I think the most important thing is to get something in place. As far as disability insurance, this is something that residents wonder about a lot, whether they should be getting it early in residency or late in residency. The truth of the matter is residents are disabled all the time. You should buy this as soon as you can afford to do so. First, take a look at what your employer is offering. Many teaching hospitals now offer disability insurance as a benefit. If it's offered and it's reasonable, use it and wait until the end of your residency to buy a good individual portable policy. If your residency isn't offering you one, might as well get your individual policy now. Buy it from an independent agent, somebody who can sell from any of the big 6 companies like Berkshire and Standard and Emeritus and MetLife. Basically, buy as much as they'll sell you. For most residents, that's probably only $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 a month benefit. Get a future purchase rider. That way, when you become an attending, you can buy more without having to prove your insurability again. Also, get an inflation rider, because if you become permanently disabled early in your career and start getting those payments when you're 30 or 35, by the time you're 60, those payments aren't going to be worth nearly as much if they're not indexed to inflation. Also, be sure to get a residual disability rider. This is what pays you if you're partially disabled and on your way back from a full disability to working full-time. Okay, the fourth important consideration for anybody starting residency is to make a successful transition from living on borrowed money to living on earned money. Remember that in the United States, the median household income is $52,000 per year. That's amazingly similar to what a resident is paid. If it feels like that's not enough money to live on, I suggest you look around, because half of Americans are living on less. If they can do it, you can do it. Okay? It's important to avoid entitlementiasis. Yes, I know you've been studying very hard for 8 or more years, and you feel like you put in your time and now you deserve to get some of the good things in life. For example, I had a resident in my class who showed up the first day of residency with a Jaguar. Now, I'm not sure exactly where the money to buy that Jaguar came from, but I assure you that most residents who are running around with $200,000 or $250,000 in debt do not have the money to be buying a Jaguar as a first-year resident. You have a terribly negative net worth when you start residency, and you ought to live like it if you ever hope to not have it. Habits that you learn as a medical student resident will set you up for eventual financial success. Realize that the teachings in your house growing up will have an impact on you. The way your parents treated money will have an impact on you. How what you did or did not learn as a child about how to manage money is going to affect the decisions you make and how you spend. So really take a close look at what you've learned about money in your life and try to convert any bad habits you have into healthy ones. Most residents ought to be renting their house as the default option. It generally takes 3 to 5 years to break even on a house purchase versus renting a similar house. So since residency is typically 3 to 5 years long, and it's a heck of a lot less hassle to rent a house than to buy one, that ought to be the default option. There are some specialized circumstances where, of course, it makes sense to buy a house, but I assure you that many of the residents who bought houses in 2006 and 2009 really ended up regretting it. Remember that credit cards aren't for credit. You're not supposed to carry a balance on those things. They really ought to be called convenience cards so you don't have to go find cash. But if you're carrying a balance on them, you need to get out of that habit as soon as possible. Make sure you're buying your automobiles with cash. There's no reason you need to be taking out auto loans to drive a $20,000 or $30,000 car. A $5,000 car is plenty reliable to get you to the hospital and back, and you should be able to come up with cash for that. If you can't, buy a $5,000 car on credit, and after you got it paid off, continuing making payments yourself. Put them in your bank account, and when that car wears out, you'll have the cash to buy your next one without taking out a loan for it. I suggest you never borrow again except for a mortgage, and I'd limit that to a 15-year mortgage at that. Doctors, as a general rule, become far too comfortable with carrying large amounts of debt. I think we just become numb to it in medical school when every semester we're signing for tens of thousands of dollars of debt. All right, let's talk about the fifth consideration, and that's retirement. Seems silly to be thinking about this when you're still in school, but the truth is the key to having a successful retirement is to start early. So start saving from your very first paycheck, even if it's a very small amount. If your residency program offers a 401k or a 403b with a match, make sure you get it. That's part of your salary. If you don't put enough into the 401k to get your match, you're leaving part of your salary on the table. In general, as a resident, because you're in a much lower tax bracket than you will be later as an attending, and even in retirement, you ought to favor Roth accounts. These are the accounts that you pay taxes on now, but the money is never taxed again. So if your 401k or 403b has a Roth option, use that. You should be able to use a Roth IRA, and even a spousal Roth IRA. Even if your spouse doesn't make any money, they can contribute from your income. The year you leave residency is still a relatively low tax year. So that year, it's worthwhile converting any tax-deferred 401k or 403b money you have into a Roth IRA. Since you don't have very much money saved for retirement and residency, it's best to stick with a simple investing plan. An index fund or two, or even one of the Vanguard Target Retirement or Life Strategy funds are perfectly fine for all of your retirement money. Focus instead on your savings rate, meaning what percentage of your income you're saving each year. That will have a far greater return on your eventual net worth than the rate of return you had those first few years when there was no money compounding. Now, I'm going to give you the most important financial advice anyone is ever going to give you. Be sure to pay attention. This is it. Live like a resident. This includes in residency. I can't believe how many residents are looking for loans just for living expenses. It's so important to avoid lifestyle creep as you transition from your residency to becoming an attendee. For example, if a resident's making $50,000 a year, he can spend $75,000 a year and feel like he's had a massive raise. It's a 50% raise compared to what he was making before. That's huge. But if you've got a typical attending income of $200,000 or $250,000, and you're only living on $75,000 a year, even after tax, you can carve out a massive portion of that attending income to build wealth with over the next 2 to 5 years. Now, I'm not suggesting to live on $75,000 a year forever, but I'm suggesting you grow into that income as slow as you possibly can. Then you can use the extra income to pay off your student loans, max out your retirement accounts, and save up a house down payment. I know this is possible because I did it. I became a millionaire just 7 years out of residency. And if you look at my average income in that time, it's well under $200,000. It's It's very much possible to do this, but you have to avoid growing into your income or even beyond your income all at once, which is something that far too many doctors do. All right, well, let's move into the Q&A portion of this, and I think Christy is going to be giving me the questions here.
Yeah, thanks. All right, again, just to remind you all, you can submit your questions in the question box on the right side of your screen there. Our first question, you touched on a little bit, but maybe you can expand on it a bit. When do you buy disability insurance, as an intern or in your final year of residency? And maybe just to expand a little bit, if your residency program doesn't offer disability insurance, how do you go about finding it, and how do you evaluate whether the insurance that they offer is good or not?
Well, that's actually kind of a tricky question, how to evaluate. The truth is, when you want to buy disability insurance is at any point before you become disabled. Since you don't know when that's going to be, obviously, buying it as early as possible is a good idea, just so you have that coverage. In fact, there are a few medical schools that will offer disability insurance to their students, and I think it's probably a good idea for medical students to buy that if it's offered. But as a general rule, I think in your intern year is the time to make sure you have some kind of coverage. If your residency is buying you for it, buying it for you, that's probably okay for the 3 to 5 years you'll be in residency. If they're not buying it for you, it's time to go get your policy. If you are using the residency group policy, it's time to look again in your final year of residency at a good individual policy you can take with you. I think everybody ought to have that, even if they end up using a group policy later. The individual policies are generally stronger policies, meaning you're more likely to get paid if you're disabled, whereas the group policies aren't nearly as strong, don't come with nearly as many benefits, and if your residency has been paying for it, the benefits will probably be pre-tax, whereas an individual policy is generally, the benefits are tax-free. As far as evaluating whether your individual residency program policy is good, the best thing to do is to take it to an independent agent and have them point out all the ways in which it's not quite as good as a good individual policy. At least then you'll know if it's worth paying more to get a few more of the bells and whistles and benefits. But every doctor is not going to become an expert in disability insurance. You might as well use the expertise of a good independent disability insurance agent to help you with that decision.
Okay, thanks. Next question, can you elaborate a little more on renting versus buying a home when starting a residency? Is there ever a time when buying a home is worth it versus renting?
Sure. If the home's going to appreciate like crazy while you're in it, then it's obviously a good move to buy a home. For example, in 2003, when I started residency in Arizona, it was just before the big housing boom. And so over the next 3 or 4 years, a lot of the housing prices doubled. And so lots of residents really did make quite a bit of money from the time they bought to the time they sell. But what most first-time home buyers don't realize is just how many expenses there are associated with purchasing a home. And the issue is, what they tend to do is they tend to just compare the cost of rent versus the cost of a mortgage payment. And that's really short-sighted because there are so many other costs associated with owning a home. For example, as a general rule, when you buy a home, you're going to spend about 5% of the value of the home on purchasing costs. You know, there might be issues with the loan, there might be the inspection, appraisal, those kinds of issues. And as a general rule, you ought to expect to spend about 10% of the value of your home selling it. Now, 6% of that goes toward the realtor commissions, but you'll usually come up with 4% of expenses, fixing things up to sell, giving some money to the new buyers, or perhaps even having it sit vacant for a few months after you've moved out. And so your home's got to appreciate a certain amount to make up for those 15% worth of value of the home. There are also additional costs that people don't think about. They don't realize that buying a lawnmower and buying a snowblower, replacing siding on the house all adds up. Refrigerators and dishwashers and flooring and toilets all break down and have to be replaced. Keep in mind that when someone is buying a property as an investment and renting it out, the rent has to cover all that stuff. So you expect rent to be much higher than the mortgage on a home because there are so many other expenses associated with buying a home. You shouldn't be impressed by the fact that a mortgage payment is less than the rent of a home, because it should be. So are there situations where it makes sense? Sure. If you're married to an attending, it probably makes sense to buy a home. If you're, for whatever reason, going to be in the same home for more than 3 to 5 years, you're going to stay there as an attending, or you were in the home as a medical student, etc., it can make sense as well. If you're in an area where you simply cannot rent the type of home you need, obviously it can make sense. So there are some situations, but I think the default option ought to be renting rather than buying, unless you fall into one of those specific categories. Far too many people coming out of medical school, and especially their spouses, are really home hungry and feel like that's the American dream, and they'll have really made it if they can finally buy a home. But in general, I think that's way overblown. You can usually rent a home that's just as nice as the one you can buy.
Great, thanks. The next question asks, does it make sense for a radiology resident to get disability insurance since their work doesn't require much physical activity?
Well, while that is true, you're obviously lower risk, assuming you're not doing any procedures, of course, than somebody, for instance, that's operating all day. But keep in mind that there are plenty of disabilities out there that have nothing to do with whacking off a couple of fingers. It may be back pain that keeps you from being able to sit in a chair all day. It might be mental disability of some kind. We all think it can't happen to us, but it really can. It might be a substance abuse issue. There might be a lot of different ways you can become disabled. So I think every doc ought to have an insurance policy in place. Now, is it worthwhile to maybe skimp a little bit on it if you're non-procedural specialty? Maybe you can pay a little bit less and not get a specialty specific policy. That might be a reasonable compromise to make. But I think everybody needs a disability policy. There's entirely too many ways to get disabled, and that's really a financial catastrophe. I ran into a doc a few months ago who was living basically on the disability policy he had bought as a resident. I think it was paying him $2,500 a month, and that's what he was living on for the rest of his life because he got disabled, and that was the only policy he had in place. He said it was okay, but that would be a pretty dramatic cutback in lifestyle for my family if we were to go back to just living on $2,500 a month. And so I think it's not worth running the risk of that yourself. It's definitely worth getting a policy in place.
Great. Next question. Do you have any special advice for women in medicine, especially if female residents are having children during residency, and et cetera?
Well, I think, women are going to have children in residency. If you're going to have a family, you can only defer it so long. If you defer it through residency, well, you're going to be having them in your first year or two as an attendant. You can only put the family off for so long. Now, are there financial issues associated with that? Well, there can be. It just depends on the residency program. In my experience, most residency programs are very good about working with their female residents who happen to have a child during residency. A lot of times they can still graduate right on time by using some of their elective time, moving shifts around, etc. But if you end up spending a few extra months in residency or an extra year because of that, well, it's not the end of the world. If you are facing a period, however, with no income due to a pregnancy, that can be a bigger issue. If your spouse is working, they can help cover that. And it may be that you just have to get child care and get back into your residency program as soon as possible to avoid those issues. Obviously, also, if you start your family in residency, you're going to have some additional expenses like more expensive health insurance plan. You may need a bigger house, etc. But in general, I don't see a lot of differences financially for women in medicine versus men in medicine. Sometimes we look at money a little bit differently, but that's usually a good thing, I think.
All right, great, thanks. Is there a penalty for converting your 403B to a Roth IRA at the end of residency? And also, is there a max amount that you can convert?
There is no penalty associated with that. Ideally, you want to make Roth 403B contributions throughout residency, but there's still plenty of hospitals that don't offer a Roth 403B to their residents. If you've had to use a regular tax-deferred 403B, then I think it's a good idea to convert that to a Roth IRA the year you finish residency. There is no penalty, but you will have to pay taxes on that money because the money wasn't taxed when it went into that 403B. When you move it to a Roth IRA, you have to pay the taxes on it. However, those taxes are lower than what they will probably be later in retirement, since you only have half a year of attending income that last year of residency. There's no maximum amount you can convert, but obviously you have to pay taxes on all of it. So the more you convert, the higher the tax bill. That's usually not a problem if you're still living something close to your resident income, because most residents just can't afford to put that much into the 403B. In general, I recommend you use a Roth IRA over a 403B during residency, except in as much to get the match if your hospital is offering one. Next question.
Okay, great. Let's see. How important is it to seek a low cost of living city for residency? I've been looking forward to adventuring to a fun city for residency, but I've been advised against this. What do you recommend?
Well, this is a balancing act for sure. I mean, is low cost of living the most important thing in choosing a residency? It probably isn't. The most important thing is probably your fit with the program, how well you fit in with the residents and the attendings that are already there. The second most important thing is probably the quality of the education. In some fields, most programs are pretty on par with each other, but there are still a number of fields where there are good programs and bad programs, and it's worth paying a little bit more in a higher cost of living city to get really good training. I mean, the point of residency is to learn how to practice medicine, and you don't want to compromise that. Now, all that being equal, I would choose a lower cost of living city. It is a dramatic difference what you can do on $50,000 in Indianapolis versus $50,000 in the Bay Area or New York City. It might seem really fun to be in New York City, but if you're barely making rent and have 4 roommates versus, owning a 3,000 square foot home for you and 4 kids in Indianapolis, I think I would err on the side of the low cost of living city. So definitely take it into consideration, recognizing that it's an important factor, but obviously not the most important factor.
Great, thanks. Next question, do you have any suggestions on what to do after residency when you can no longer contribute to a Roth IRA because your salary is too high?
Sure, I have a really great suggestion. Continue using the Roth IRA. A lot of people don't know about what I call the backdoor Roth IRA. And it's hard to explain this in just a few minutes without any visuals, but let me see if I can try. The rule up until 2010 was that if you had an income over something like $150,000 or $160,000, as most doctors will, you could neither convert tax-deferred money to Roth IRAs, nor could you contribute to a Roth IRA because your income was too high. Starting in 2010, that law was changed such that you still cannot contribute directly to a Roth IRA, but you can convert any type of IRA to a Roth IRA. So what that does is it opens a loophole, and it's not some tax secret or anything. The IRS knows people are doing this, and it's considered completely legitimate. What you do is you make a contribution to a regular traditional IRA. As an attending, you make too much money to deduct that, so you call it a non-deductible traditional IRA. And then the next day, or if you want to wait a few weeks, you convert it to a Roth IRA. Since that money is never deductible anyway, there's really no cost to doing that. And voila, you've got a Roth IRA through the back door. Now, there is a caveat to this in that you cannot have any other tax-deferred IRA money, such as a traditional IRA or a SEP IRA or a simple IRA, to be able to do that contribution and conversion each year due to a pro rata calculation that the IRS makes you make. Basically, it makes you look at all of your IRA money, and if you only decide to convert $5,000 of that and you have $50,000 of that, it all comes out proportionally or pro rata. So you want to make sure on December 31st each year that you don't have any tax-deferred money in IRAs. So the way you do that is you either convert it all, or you simply transfer your IRA money into a 401k, which doesn't apply in that calculation the IRS makes you do. So essentially, I think you ought to keep making Roth IRA contributions as an attending. I've continued to do so every year of my career, and that'll be very helpful in retirement because it gives me some tax diversification, meaning I have both tax-deferred money and tax-free money I can spend in retirement. Next question.
Just a quick follow-up on that one. Do you have any resources that you would recommend for learning more about Roth IRAs and the backdoor Roth and so forth?
Sure. I've blogged about this several times on my website. If you Google the white coat investor and backdoor Roth IRA, you'll come up with most of them. And I know it sometimes takes a couple of times through it before you can wrap your head around the concept. But just remember this, that you can continue to make Roth IRA contributions as an attending. It just gets a little more complicated.
Okay, thanks. Next question, can Congress change the PSLF program retroactively?
Sure, Congress can do whatever they want. They can institute a doctor draft again if they want to as well and send us all to war. Congress has an immense amount of power, and and I worry about this because I can just see the headlines a few years from now when doctors really start getting this public service loan forgiveness. Can you imagine the headlines? Doctors getting $500,000 worth of loans forgiven. It's not going to play well in the media. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Congress change the rules. Now, the Obama administration made a proposal this spring that amount of forgiveness be limited to $57,000 a year, which would be a total game changer for physicians hoping for this forgiveness, because most of them are thinking they want to get $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 forgiven, and $57,000, while nice, is a drop in the bucket compared to that. And so yes, they can change it retroactively. I like to think that they would grandfather in the people that are already in the program making IBR or pay payments, and maybe even those who are in medical school still taking out loans, but certainly there's no guarantee of that happening. There is a risk there. Now, the best way, I think, to mitigate that risk if you're going for public service loan forgiveness is to make those payments anyway, but make them on the side into your own investing account. And if, when you get to the 10 years of payments and your loans are actually paid off by the public service loan forgiveness program, well, it'll be like you got a windfall from that investment account. And if the program ever changes, well, you can turn around and use that money in the investment account to pay off the loans. So you can hedge your bets in a sense that way. Next question.
Great, thanks. Next question, is it smart to go 100% equities in your portfolio as a resident since you are guaranteed a stable high income as an attending and can risk the downturns?
Well, the truth is, because your portfolio as a resident is so tiny compared to what it will eventually need to be when you retire, it really doesn't matter what you invest in. You could be ultra conservative, you could be ultra risky. The most important thing, of course, is how much you're saving, because that has a much greater effect on how much money you'll eventually end up with. So if there's ever a time in your life to go 100% stocks or equities, it's when you're a resident. However, I think there's some wisdom in having a moderated approach, even when your portfolio is tiny. Benjamin Graham, who is the great investor that Warren Buffett learned everything he knows from, once said that you should never have more than 75% stocks in your portfolio or less than 25% stocks in your portfolio. I think there's a lot of wisdom there. So even as a resident, I had a balanced portfolio. Truthfully, it didn't make a lot of difference. If I had it all to do over again, I'd probably pick something really simple like a target retirement fund at Vanguard for my portfolio. But, if you want to go 100% equities, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to do, as long as you stick with it. The biggest problem with people who go 100% stocks is when the next 2008 comes along and the value of your investment account gets cut in half, you sell out and go to cash or go to bonds, locking in your losses. It's far more important that you stick with your plan than what your plan originally was, as long as it's something reasonable.
Great, thanks. Next question, what is the advantage of making low payments on student loans while the interest continues to accrue? Wouldn't it be better to pay it off as much as you can, as quickly as you can?
Well, it depends. If you're planning to pay off those loans and you're absolutely 100% sure you're going to pay them off, then you're right. You ought to pay them down as fast as you can. However, most residents aren't sure yet whether they're going to take a job that qualifies for public service loan forgiveness, and so they need to hedge their bets. The secret to getting a lot of money forgiven is to make as many low payments as possible in residency and fellowship. That's the point of making the really low payments, is to get as many payments as you can. You have to make 120 of them to get public service loan forgiveness. If you can make 36 or 48 or even 60 of those in residency that are only $100 payments, they all count just the same as $5,000 a month payments you might make as an attending. So you want to get as many of those in during residency as you can if you're going for forgiveness. If you're not going for forgiveness, then yeah, pay off your loans as fast as you can.
Thanks. Our next question, do you have a specific disability insurance company that you would recommend for a surgeon? The research on this subject is difficult.
The research is difficult, and the reason why is because it's complicated. Life insurance is ridiculously simple, right? You can basically look at one product, a 30-year level term policy, and then all you got to do is decide how much you want, and you can go to websites like termforsale.com. I don't have any financial relationship with them, and they'll basically tell you all the companies that sell that insurance product, and you can, rank order them by price. It's like a commodity. It's like buying beans or rice. It's all the same. You just buy the one that's cheapest. However, disability insurance is complicated. There's a lot of moving parts and bells and whistles. And the reason for that is because disability is complicated, whereas life and death really isn't. I work in the emergency department, so, I might argue that there is a little bit of gray in between life and death. But the truth is, within an hour or so, we're going to sort it out, and it's going to be one or the other. Disability is not like that, though. There's a lot of gray. And because of that, the contracts are very complicated. They have to account for a lot of possibilities, in all the varying shades of gray of disability. And so it's really pays to get an expert on your side to help you evaluate which policy is the best for you. And it varies by specialty, and it varies by state, and it varies by gender, and it varies by your health status. And so the best thing to do is to go get an independent insurance agent that can sell you a policy from any of the big 6 companies, including Berkshire and Standard and MetLife and Ameritas and Mass Mutual and Principal. And that way they can pull these out and show you what the cost would be for your specialty and your state, show you the difference between the policies, and it doesn't necessarily mean you should buy the very, best one with all the bells and whistles. Sometimes it's better to buy one that's a little bit less expensive and has a little bit fewer benefits. For example, for emergency doctors, Principal tends to be a really good policy because of the way they look at emergency docs. Compared to other insurance companies, they consider them less risky. And so the price tends to be better with Principal. For surgeons, I don't know which company that is, but a good independent disability insurance agent can help you determine that. What you don't want to do is go to a captive disability insurance agent that only sells policies for one company, because you're almost surely going to end up with a policy from that company. If you need help with the referral to an independent agent, go ahead and email me at editor@whitecoatinvestor.com. I'll get you in touch with somebody.
Great, thanks. Next question, if my interest rate is low for my debt, does it make sense to extend my payments and put the rest into an investment?
Well, at a certain interest rate, it can make sense. When I came out of medical school in 2003, all of my classmates refinanced their loans at about 1%. Now, 1% is less than the rate of inflation. Even at our terribly low interest rates these days, you can still find a bank account paying 1%. So obviously there's a point there where if you're paying interest at 1 or 2% and you're making money at 5 or 6%, well, you've got a little bit of an arbitrage there, and that would be smart. However, any resident that's come out in the last 5 or 10 years probably has their loans at 6 or 8%, and that is a much different story. There really aren't any guaranteed investments out there that pay anything near 6 or 8%. And so that's a fantastic guaranteed investment to pay those loans down. Now I would encourage anybody with loans like that to pay them off as soon as possible. If you're somewhere in between 3 or 4 or 5% range, well, you've got a dilemma. It probably still makes sense to max out your retirement accounts before paying off those loans. But if you're now looking at investing in a taxable account, well, a 3 or 4 or 5% student loan is still a pretty good investment, and I'd be throwing money there. So it depends on the interest rate. It depends on your comfort with debt, and it depends on whether or not you've already maxed out all available tax-advantaged retirement accounts.
Sorry, pulling up the next question here. For someone starting a private practice, do you recommend filing an S Corp or a sole proprietor? What are the pros and cons of each?
Well, a lot of people think that an S Corp or any type of corporation is this way to all of a sudden get rid of all this liability and lower your taxes, and they see it as this panacea. I've got to incorporate because then I'm going to be set. But the truth of the matter is when you really look into it, you don't lose a lot of liability by incorporating, because your main source of liability as a physician is malpractice. And the law doesn't care if you're a corporation with regards to malpractice. All malpractice is personal. So you get no malpractice liability shielding at all for being incorporated. Now, you do get some business liability. For example, if you have some employees and the employees decide to sue you for, breach of contract or something like that, well, the corporation can provide you some, protection there. But if you're just an independent contractor, you got nobody working for you, and you're contracting with the hospital to provide services, that corporation really doesn't give you any liability protection at all. The tax benefit is also much lower than most people think. Almost all of your business expenses can be deducted as a sole proprietor just as easily as if you're a corporation. All those, business lunches and white coats and scrubs and that kind of stuff can be deducted by a sole proprietor. The only taxes you really save as an S Corp is the payroll taxes on money that you call dividends and not salary. For example, if you get paid $300,000 and you decide you're going to call $200,000 of it salary and $300,000 of it dividend, then you don't have to pay payroll taxes on that last $100,000. Now, since you've already got the $200,000 salary, you've already maxed out your Social Security taxes, because you only pay that on the first $117,000 of income. However, you have to pay Medicare taxes, 2.9% of your income for a business owner, of every dollar you make, no matter how much you make. So, if you were making $300,000 and you decided to incorporate, and you called $200,000 salary and $100,000 dividend, you wouldn't have to pay Medicare taxes on that $100,000. That would save you about $2,900 in taxes a year. So if your cost of incorporating and filing the extra tax forms required for that, and the hassle associated with it, is worth less than $2,900, then it's worth doing for tax purposes. If not, well, it's probably not worth doing. So it just depends on your situation. But you have to be careful deciding on how much you call salary and how much you call dividend. If you're trying to call yourself, a physician that's taking a $30,000 salary and $270,000 in dividends, the IRS is pretty wise for that, and they're going to bust you.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Do you have any advice for how to decide if we should go with loan forgiveness or try to pay back our loans?
Well, I think it really comes down to the job you take right out of residency. Almost all residency and fellowship positions are at 501c3 hospitals. And so those payments all counted toward public service loan forgiveness. If you are then going to be taking a job where you'll be working at a 501c3 hospital for the next 4 years, it's a no-brainer for forgiveness. Keep making the pay payments, and after you've made 120 of them total, the rest of your loans should be forgiven. If, however, you're going into private practice, you're going to go work for a group, or you're going to be employed by a hospital that's not a 501c3, then it's probably not worth going for the pay forgiveness at 20 years. The reason is because most docs get the loans paid off much faster than that. However, if you're a very lowly paid doctor, say you're making $150,000 a year, and you have a lot of student debt, say $500,000, you may still be better off going for that forgiveness at 20 years, even though it's taxable and even though you got to make payments for 20 years. However, in general, if you're not going to get public service loan forgiveness, as you come out of residency, you ought to refinance your debt and pay it back as fast as you can. You know, I think most docs who are going to be paying back their debt ought to have it paid off in less than 5 years, and preferably within about 2. That means you got to live like a resident until it's gone, of course.
Very good. Well, I think that is all of our questions. I think we may have time for one more if anybody else wants to submit one really quickly. But if not, I think that will...
While people are submitting questions, just by way of advice, each of these questions that's been submitted and each of the subjects touched on tonight is the subject of a blog post somewhere on my website. So if you go to the White Coat Investor at whitecoatinvestor.com and type that subject into the search bar, you're going to pull up a post that goes into further detail on each of these subjects, and hopefully will provide the answers you're looking for, especially if it feels like you're just drinking out of a fire hose tonight and having all these things thrown at you. There's plenty of time for you to digest it at your own pace, reading it on the website.
We've got one more question here. What do you think about using home equity to pay off debt if home equity is available?
Well, I think that can be a great solution. The problem for most residents is that home equity isn't available because most medical students can't afford to buy a home. However, converting a debt from high interest, non-deductible debt, because for most attending physicians, student loan interest isn't deductible, into low interest, deductible debt, because most home equity debt is deductible, at least up to $100,000. I think that's a great move. There is some risk there, of course, in that, if you end up, the house gets foreclosed on, you'll lose that money. So there are some downsides there, but there's a lot of good things about using home equity to pay off your debt. Not the least of which is if you end up declaring bankruptcy, any mortgage debt gets wiped out, but student loan debt never does in bankruptcy. Hopefully, it will be a rare problem for physicians.
Good. Let's see. We'll do, I think that'll wrap us up for the evening. We have a couple more, but we're going to start a thread in the Finance and Investing Forum on studentdoctor.net. So I'd encourage all of you to go over and check that out. You can comment there, discuss any of these issues further, and the couple questions that were submitted at the last minute, we'll post those there, and people can discuss and answer those there. Also, if you want to hear any of this again or share it with anybody else, as was mentioned earlier, we'll be posting it on the Student Doctor YouTube channel in the near future. It'll take us a couple days to get that up and ready, but you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter if you want to see when that's available. We'll post it there. So, Dr. Dahle, thank you so much for sharing with us tonight, and thanks to all of you who spent an hour with us this evening. I hope it was helpful to you. So have a great night.
You're very welcome.